What is the scariest ghost story you ever heard? Story 1. I was in 2nd grade, and my sister was in 4th grade. My parents had just bought a house on a 160-acre farm, very far out of town. The farm had a barn, 2 grain bins, a feed room, and a 40 by 20-foot shop. A few weeks after moving in, while my parents were busy cleaning and repairing the house, which needed quite a bit of work, my sister and I were playing outside the shop. There was a very large pond nearby, and on one side of it began a tree line that marked the start of the forest, which stretched for several hundred acres, though not all of it belonged to us. My sister and I were playing when we heard a noise coming from the woods. It wasn't a screaming cry for help, but more of an animal hoot, definitely not a bird. Being kids, we hooted back at it. The only sound I can compare it to is the noise a monkey makes, the kind of shriek a distressed monkey might let out. We kept calling out, hoping to provoke it, and every so often we heard a reply, but then it stopped. The whole ordeal lasted maybe 2 minutes. This might not sound profound, but this was in central Oklahoma. It was a few months after we had settled into the house. I was lying on the floor in my underwear, eating a bowl of cereal. My mom was lying nearby, watching TV. My sister ran in from the other living room and asked if I had just been outside. I said no, I'd been inside the whole time. My mom confirmed this, looking concerned, and asked why. My sister refused to believe us. She explained that she had been doing homework in the other living room, looked up and saw a kid in his underwear run past the big sliding glass door that led to our backyard. The backyard was always illuminated at night by a light on top of an electrical pole that gave off an eerie green glow. We reassured her that I'd been inside the whole time, but she was adamant about what she saw. She wasn't in the habit of lying. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. For several years, nothing else noteworthy happened. It was a beautiful piece of property, but all of us noticed it had a slightly uneasy atmosphere. By the time I was a freshman in high school, I was riding my horse along the border of the forest I'd mentioned earlier. I rode the length of it, made a big circle, and prepared to do it again because it was such an enjoyable ride. On the second pass, though, something in the woods spooked my horse and it threw me. My saddle wasn't cinched correctly, and I was tossed awkwardly. Honestly, it happened too quickly to react. I broke both my arms. It was about 3 months after my accident, and my casts were finally off. We had started putting a new roof on the house. This is the only thing I can think of that might have been the catalyst for the next few occurrences. I want to be very clear. I am the type of person who truly believes there is an explanation for everything. I am not superstitious, and I don't believe in God or ghosts, but I cannot explain the following events. We began the roofing process. It took several weeks since we did it in sections. Money was tight, my parents worked constantly, and we decided to handle it ourselves. In one of the living rooms, the same one where I'd been lying on the floor eating cereal back in 2nd grade, there was a chandelier. It was a gaudy, hideous thing covered with hundreds of fake crystals. The crystals hung on the chandelier by hooks similar to the kind used for Christmas ornaments, only small enough to fit through tiny holes. My sister and I were usually the last to leave the house in the mornings. We always left for school at the same time, and were the first to arrive home in the afternoon. We would come back to find a handful of the chandelier's crystals lying on the floor. It made no sense. My mother was unsettled by it, and my father eventually became angry. At first, he thought it was a joke. We left the crystals on the floor to show him, and our seriousness finally convinced him we weren't playing a prank. There was no explanation I could think of that accounted for the crystals falling. It wasn't us being on the roof banging around. Nobody was home during the day to work on it, and the crystals continued to fall for a while, even after the roof was completed. There was no way for the crystals to lift their wire hooks through the holes and fall, even if we had been jumping up and down on the roof. It took concentration just to fit the hooks back into the holes. Eventually, it stopped, but there was never an explanation. Things started to get strange. By this time, my parents were divorced and my sister was away at college. My mom had moved into town, while my dad stayed at the farm. I split my time between them, spending every other night at my mom's. My sister's old room remained exactly as she had left it when she went off to college. It stayed unused. The door kept shut. One night, I was alone at my dad's house. He was working a night shift and wouldn't be home until after midnight. I was in the living room, the same one with the chandelier I've been describing, sitting in a chair and watching TV. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang. It came from my sister's room. I froze. My entire body locked up. I couldn't make myself move. I sat there and listened, but there was nothing. Eventually, I forced myself to get up and grabbed a walking staff I had carved as a birthday present for my dad. He kept it as a decoration in the living room. Clutching the staff, I searched the back of the house first, checking all the doors and windows, then moved slowly toward the bedrooms. I checked my dad's room, then my own. After making sure no one had broken in, I stood outside my sister's door, listening. Eventually, I summoned the courage to twist the doorknob just enough to open it. I kicked the door lightly and flipped on the lights. A speaker had fallen off my sister's desk, dangling by the red and black copper wires. It was the left speaker of a nice stereo. I picked it up to put it back on the desk, and that's when I noticed the dust. The room had been unused for so long that a thick layer had settled everywhere, leaving a clean square where the speaker had been sitting. It hadn't been in an unstable position. It shouldn't have fallen on its own. Then I noticed something even stranger, a path traced through the dust by the 4 rubber pads on the bottom of the speaker. The speaker had clearly been pushed. I sent my dad a text explaining what had happened, then left the house. This is the scariest part of my story. I have no explanation for what happened, and I pride myself on being a very rational person. Once again, I was alone in the house. Dad was working a night shift, and Mom was out of town. It was around 10 at night, and I was in the same living room with the chandelier, watching TV. I got up to grab a snack. Stepping through the doorway into the foyer, I turned the corner to the right, heading toward the kitchen. As I looked up, I froze. Straight ahead of me, staring through the window, was a kid with no shirt on. This wasn't a neighbor kid. There were no neighbors for miles. We were in the middle of nowhere. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. My whole body locked in place. Then, almost in self-defense, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, a wave of relief washing over me. It had to be my reflection. I stood there, frozen, still staring at the window when my reflection suddenly took off running. In the direction it ran was the sliding glass door, the only place it could have gone. The kid should have been plainly visible, but no one appeared. The relief I had felt only seconds earlier evaporated, replaced by the worst feeling I've ever experienced. My heart dropped. My face went hot. My mind went blank. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. It was as if my body had gone into shock. I stood there, breathing hard, probably hyperventilating, until suddenly the paralysis broke. I bolted for my keys. Even though going outside meant running straight into whatever that thing was, there was no way I could stay in the house. I sprinted to my truck, jumped inside, and peeled out of the driveway. As I neared the end of the long, straight stretch of gravel, I forced myself to look into the rearview mirror. I half expected to see the kid standing under the eerie green glow of the electrical pole's light, but the yard was empty. Story 2. Although I'm sure many won't believe me, this is a true story that I personally experienced. Names have been changed, except one, Willis. Fall, 2003, my sophomore year of high school. I had moved to town just a year earlier, and after some adjustments, I had made a bunch of really good friends. Unlike the stereotype, high school was made up of very loose cliques that mixed freely. This led to rather large parties and events whenever word got out. The town itself sits on the edge of a major city, a good-sized suburb, but just a few miles out, you immediately hit farmland. Perhaps this is what fostered the school's friendliness. But anyway, within my closer group of friends, Wicca was becoming a big thing. Several of them had become solo practitioners, while others were picking up books to see what all the fuss was about. I'll admit, the books were interesting reads, but I didn't see any truth in them. They sounded more like wishful thinking, and I was going through a very hardcore atheist phase. Still, it was all fascinating. Eventually, we formed a philosophical club that met after school to share our various beliefs. It started with 5 people, but within a month we were up to around 15, with a few people coming and going. At the core of the club was a guy named Eric. He was a devout Wiccan and considered the expert on the religion, although other members often disagreed. Eric's original goal was to find more people to form a small coven with him as the leader. About 8 of us decided to give his idea a try, some out of belief, others out of curiosity. The first spell we tried was one to change the weather and bring on snow. Its success was very debatable, considering it was fall in the Northeast United States and the weather was always unpredictable. So we moved on to more specific spells, for things like luck or protection. Everyone in the group was a strong believer in the threefold law. Soon, other people from the club started hearing about our experiments and rituals and joined in as well. Eric lived out in the country part of town, near a large forest, which quickly became our base of operations. It was out of the way, crisscrossed with creeks, and a railway ran right through the middle of it. About once every 2 weeks, we would walk down the railway at night and try a different spell in the woods. At first, nothing really happened. The more devoted Wiccans in the group had different theories as to why. Eventually, it was agreed that the problem was the presence of non-believers in the rituals, namely me, but I convinced them to let me keep coming anyway. It was a Friday around mid-October. 6 or 7 of us went out into the woods late at night as usual. We had a new guy with us, a curious fellow named Jared, who was a rather large individual and genuinely nice. The night was chilly, with a good amount of moonlight filtering through the trees. Everyone was talking about one thing or another. I remember being worried about our proximity to the train tracks and the possibility of running into a knife-wielding hobo. so I told the others I would take guard duty and leave them alone to do their spellcrafting. I don't really know what happened during the ritual. I heard raised voices and sneaked a few glances, seeing them all standing in a circle, chanting. About an hour later they finished up, and we all made our way home. Jared, however, was acting rather strange, and he and Eric lagged behind, talking about something. For the rest of the night he was unusually quiet. Monday came around. We all met up in the morning after getting off the buses. Jared showed up looking completely disheveled. His hair was greasy, his eyes were baggy, and he couldn't seem to keep his thoughts together. Concerned, we all bombarded him with questions. His story was chilling. Something had followed him home from the woods. He said he first saw it during the ritual, flying just above the tree line in circles. It was long and black, a humanoid figure with a cloak or cape. According to him, it stared at him during the ritual and then followed him back home, where it began orbiting his house. He couldn't sleep, and even daybreak didn't banish it. It stayed in the shadows, watching him all day. When Saturday night rolled around, he tried to get some sleep at last. By this point, Jared was crying, but he kept going. He said that in the night, the thing came into his room and stood over his bed. Finally, he confronted it, screaming at it to go away. It touched his forehead with its finger and laughed. Jared's story soon degraded into frantic sobs. He called it the demon and claimed it was still haunting him, even now, flying above our school, waiting. A majority of the Wiccans bolted outside, intent on confronting this creature. Those who remained behind began discussing protection spells or pulling grimoires from their packs. The rest of us comforted Jared with hugs and tissues, forming a circle around him before things escalated further. Classes were about to start, so our gathering was forced to break up, though not before assigning people to watch over Jared throughout the day. After school, the Wiccans held an emergency coven meeting where battle plans were drawn up. Grimoires were open, bold claims were made, and gifts of protection were showered upon Jared. Confusion was thick in the air. You could almost smell fear on some people, while others radiated pure resolve. I stayed quiet, my smug atheist self, because my thoughts on the matter were less than sympathetic. My opinion at the time was simple. Jared, struggling with self-esteem issues because of his weight, was having a mental breakdown. Wanting attention, he had crafted a story to put himself in the spotlight. This was high school, after all. No other member had seen the demon or felt it. There had already been numerous little ghost stories shared at club meetings, and those stories always made everyone stop and listen. Some even became the foundation for relationships. Still, I was curious. This was either a confrontation with the unknown or a deep psychological observation. Either way, we needed to be there for Jared. We all cared. Aside from the protection tokens and spells everyone was preparing, another solution was proposed, an Ouija board. Eric had recently crafted one himself, burning its lettering into a large piece of wood. It was rather nicely made, I must admit. Our group was much smaller this time. The only constants were Eric and me. We were joined by two others, Rochelle and Thomas. Eric explained how the board used our life force to power contact with the other side. Thomas and I shared similar views that it was a psychological trick, herd mentality. Rochelle, I don't know, she wasn't the sort to be easily roped into beliefs. We all settled in and began. At first, we were talking to the stereotypical spirits. So forgettable, I can't even remember them. After over an hour, the pointer started going crazy fast, zip-ping around the board with an odd twirling motion right before it landed on a letter. What it spelled out was vulgar and explicit. I'm going to off you. You will bleed, freakers. It also seemed unusually interested in Rochelle, which we found distinctly odd. When is her birthday, it asked. She said it out loud and we all murmured. I will essay her first. We all laughed. Stupid wuss. Smash her. Wuss. They came one right after the other. It wouldn't stop. Eric declared this bad mojo and said we should banish the spirit and move on. That prompted a no. The other three of us were hooked. We asked for a name. No. We asked why it wanted to off Rochelle or smash her. Finally, Eric had had enough and tried to dismiss it. No. Thomas pushed for a name, and the pointer very slowly spelled W-I-L-L-I-S. Then the pointer slid off the board. We all laughed, even Eric, who suspected someone was fabricating a good story. I know I wasn't. I'd given it a solid try even though I didn't believe it. We tried a few more times with nothing interesting, then called it a night. Winter/spring, 2004 to 2005. The coven had devolved into smaller groups by then, though everyone stayed in regular contact in some form. Most of us still ate lunch together at least. The philosophical club, however, fell into ruin. I had a mental breakdown as more and more people began experiencing strange happenings. It ended in a rant you might expect to find on the Reddit community for atheism. Having been observing all this time, the amount of ammunition I had was staggering. I know I shattered some people's faith that day, but maybe I did some good too. At some point, Jared started acting normal again. I don't know the circumstances, but he found something that gave him peace. I asked, but the topic seemed to visibly upset him, or perhaps my speech had hit too close to home. Many of us began directing our energy in a more classic ghost hunting direction, sneaking into local abandoned buildings with cameras, creeping through graveyards, and looking up places online we could drive to on weekends. It was a lot of fun. I became the group's debunker, though our more spiritual members gave me a nickname, Null. Story 3. A little backstory. Where I used to live in Pennsylvania, there was a building just down the hill from our house. We lived on a hill, and about 400 yards from the bottom of the first slope, there was a cliff that led down to the river. The building had been a butcher's shop for decades. The owner at the time was the grandson of the original owner. He had moved the shop across town about 2 decades before I was born, around 1967. For roughly 10 years after that, the building was used as a mechanic's shop, taking advantage of its unique split-level layout. Vehicles could be pulled in from the upper street and serviced from the lower level. In the late 70s, the mechanic moved to a neighboring town, and the shop near us was shut down. The building sat unattended for several years until the mid-80s, when a squatter moved in. He was a homeless man who did odd jobs for local residents. The town itself was fairly concentrated, with about 5,000 people in a small area. Once you left town, you truly left civilization behind. Everyone called him Ed. He had apparently done work for the mechanic's shop and was a World War II veteran who had returned home mentally scarred from the war. In the early 90s, a group of teenagers began harassing Ed. They would throw garbage at him, taunt him, and occasionally chase him. It never went much further until one day when they cornered him on the upper level of the old shop. One of the teens began hitting him with an old broomstick. Ed was pushing 70 at the time and could do little to defend himself. A neighbor witnessed the attack and called the police before the beating could escalate further. When the officers arrived, they scared the teenagers away, arrested one for possession, and started looking for Ed to ensure he was all right. They never found him. For a while, everyone assumed he had simply run off. That assumption changed when a resident of one of the buildings near the old shop reported a horrible smell seeping from the lower level, where the old oil pit of the shop was located. There, in the mixture of blood and dirt, was Ed. Most of the oil had seeped out, I was told. The body was in a horrible state of decay, having been dead for about a month, but it was clear he had sustained a tremendous beating. No autopsy was performed, and people began reaching out to Ed's family to inform them of his death. They could locate only a woman in her early 90s who supposedly had some relation to him. She identified Ed as her younger cousin, but knew very little about him and had only met him once or twice. Ed was buried, and the teenagers were tried for various crimes, ranging from accidental death to the possession charges mentioned earlier. Oddly, most of them were acquitted. Only the possession charge stuck, due in part to the absence of an autopsy and the fact that the teens were all minors, aged 13 to 15. A procedural mistake also led to one of the teens being beaten severely by an adult who may or may not have been a police officer at the time. This resulted in the dismissal of all charges except possession. Time passed, and the incident was largely forgotten. In the early 2000s, the butcher finally passed away. By then, he had become a fairly prominent man in town, continuing a family legacy that had lasted for decades. His son, who was not carrying on the business, decided to hold a memorial for his father in the old shop. He and a few friends went to clean up the old shop in preparation for the memorial. They had to install a new front door on the upper level, as the old one had been completely demolished from years of neglect. During this process, they unearthed an old metal container that had been cemented directly into the wall. Inside the container were photographs of his father and grandfather, the second-generation butcher, dating back to the 1950s when they had worked together. The son, who would have been a fourth-generation butcher had he continued the family trade, decided these photos would be perfect for the memorial. He had a few enlarged to poster size and displayed them at the event. Also in the box was a diary that had remained untouched for more than 40 years. On the day of the memorial, people began noticing another man appearing in several of the photographs. It was Ed. He had worked for the second-generation butcher for about a decade right after World War II and had been present when the third-generation butcher took over the shop. As the son read his father's diary, he discovered that the relationship between the third-generation butcher and Ed had turned bitter by the mid-60s, after his grandfather retired. They had gotten into several fights over the years, escalating to serious animosity. The last entry in the diary concerned the move across town. The third-generation butcher had written, "I can't take it anymore. We have to leave." This puzzled the son, prompting him to backtrack and piece together what had happened. Apparently, the butcher had gotten into a physical altercation with Ed that resulted in Ed being struck in the back of the head with a cleaver. The diary continued, "I can tell no one this, as it will ruin my entire family, but I've buried him in the blood pit. The shop will mask the smell, and I don't think anyone will miss him. May God have mercy on my soul. When the auto shop took over, they had filled the pit with oil and other debris to mask the smell of animal blood and parts. The pit was about 6 feet deep. Over time, the oil seeped into the surrounding soil, weakening its integrity and causing part of the wall to collapse, revealing the horribly decayed corpse of Ed. The son decided to consult the medical examiner, who had originally examined Ed's body, and began the process to have him exhumed. He wanted to either confirm the diary's claim or clear his father's name. By then, the cousin had passed away, and no one opposed the exhumation, so the coffin was brought up. The examiner examined the corpse once more. Sure enough, he found that Ed had died primarily from sharp force trauma rather than blunt trauma. He also noticed something unusual about the remaining tissue. It was drenched in oil and far better preserved than it should have been. The debris the auto shop had dumped on top of Ed had inadvertently delayed the natural decay that should have occurred. The teens had surely been beating someone that day. The police began searching for them to question them. The story soon took a grotesque turn. According to the police report, the teens claimed that an elderly man had been following them and had chased them into the old shop. They insisted they were only defending themselves and ran away at the first chance they got. There were 4 teens mentioned in the report. All were now dead. Each had taken their own life in a different way. One had jumped into the river at the nearby dam and drowned. One had hanged herself. One had sat in a running car inside the garage, and the last had slit his wrists. They all had one thing in common, however. Each had complained for years after the beating incident that someone was following them. At times, they mentioned seeing the same car tailing them home from work or school, day after day, week after week. Sometimes it was a stranger at the mall. Other times, a shadowy figure outside their house. Of the 4, only one left any kind of message after taking his own life. Scrawled in blood on the bathroom wall beside his body were the sloppy yet clearly legible words, "Thank you, Ed." It was later determined that this individual likely could not have written the message himself. The severe blood loss combined with the injuries to his arms would have rendered them almost completely useless. Story 4. Back when I was around 10 or 12 years old, I can't quite remember exactly, my mother won some kind of lucky draw, and we got access to a bungalow by the beach for a short getaway. Since the place was massive, we invited some relatives to join us too. Being young, I was thrilled. I couldn't wait to hang out with my cousins, have barbecues, mess around, and most importantly, not be at home. I don't know why, but even though the bungalow was technically just another house we'd be staying in for a week, the fact that it wasn't mine somehow made it feel special. When we arrived and checked in, the caretaker was there to hand over the keys and show us around. He led us through the rooms, pointed out the bathrooms, and explained the basics. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was how huge the place was. It had 2 stories and about 7 rooms, not counting the living room and kitchen. The second thing I noticed was that the floor was dusty. The kind of dusty where you don't really see the dirt, but you can definitely feel it on your feet. So I decided to pick my own bedroom and ran up the stairs toward a room at the far end of the hallway. With my small, scrawny fingers, I grabbed the doorknob and tried twisting it, but the door wouldn't open. Being as young as I was, I started slamming the door in frustration until the caretaker came up and told me to stop. He muttered something either too quietly for me to hear or in words I didn't understand back then. My dad came over and asked him to unlock the door, but the caretaker refused. I couldn't make sense of what he said, but my dad later told me it was just a storeroom. I quickly forgot about it and chose the room directly opposite instead, literally right across from it, maybe 10 steps away at most. A while later, my relatives started arriving. Cousins, aunts, uncles, the whole noisy crowd. They brought food for a potluck and filled the place with laughter and chatter. I led my cousins upstairs to show them my room. It had a balcony, which felt like a big deal to me, especially since I didn't have one at home. Sharing my room that night were 2 of my cousins who were staying over. One was a year older than me, and the other was about 5 years older. Both of them completely towered over me. I was short and skinny, while they were tall and a bit overweight. My sister and 2 other cousins were also there earlier. We played card games, joked around, and talked until it got late. Eventually, those who weren't staying the night went home, leaving just me and my 2 bigger cousins in the room. None of us were ready to sleep yet, so we pulled out our Game Boys and, if I remember right, played Pokemon for a while. I think it was around 3 in the morning when I finally decided it was time to sleep. Since I was the smallest, I got stuck with the worst spot, the middle. The beds had been pushed together, so I ended up lying right on the crack between them. It was incredibly uncomfortable, but I was so tired that I fell asleep anyway, though not without complaining first. Halfway through the night, I woke up to the sound of my cousins bickering about something. They were both standing by the balcony, looking toward the bungalow next to ours. Still half asleep, I dragged myself up, grabbed the edge of the bed for balance, and slowly walked over to them. One of them mentioned seeing a figure over at the other bungalow. I brushed it off, thinking it was probably just someone else who couldn't sleep, and looked across the street with them for a moment before going back to bed. Day 2. As soon as I woke up, I went straight downstairs looking for food. During breakfast, my mom asked if any of us had gone downstairs in the middle of the night. I glanced at my cousins, and we all shrugged. None of us had left the room. My mom stared at me for a moment, then quietly continued eating. I spent most of the day watching my cousin play Final Fantasy X in the living room until it was time for dinner. We all gathered outside for the barbecue, and out of nowhere my dad started talking about ghosts. He specifically mentioned the Pontianak, a kind of female vampire with long nails and sharp teeth, well known in my country. Being superstitious, he added that it was said to be most active on Thursday nights, and the way to fend it off was to point sharp objects at it or something along those lines. I can't quite remember all the details. It was Thursday then, but none of us really paid much attention. My dad asked if I'd felt or seen anything strange during the first night. I said no, but I vaguely remembered that every time I went to the toilet alone, the hair on the back of my neck would stand up. It always creeped me out, but I'd just finish quickly and rush back to my room. The toilet, by the way, was right beside my room, relatively close to the locked door. Later that night, when everyone was already in their rooms, my phone battery was running low, and I had to go downstairs to grab my charger from the table. As soon as I reached the ground floor, my hair stood on end, and a wave of fear washed over me. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know something is about to pounce on you but you don't know where or when. That sense of impending danger clung to me as I snatched the charger with sweaty palms and bolted back up the stairs. I didn't say anything to anyone because I didn't want to sound like a wuss. That night, my cousins had already gone home, so I went to sleep in my dad's room. At some point in the night, I woke up to a loud bang. My dad immediately pulled me into a hug. That was strange. My dad isn't the kind of person who hugs me or shows affection like that, but I just shrugged it off and went back to sleep. I woke up again in the middle of the night and for some reason went to the toilet outside instead of using the one in my dad's room. On the way, I saw one of my aunts and asked her what time it was. She said it was 3 and had a troubled look on her face. She asked if I could hear that. I said no, went to the toilet, and went back to sleep. The next morning, my dad gathered everyone in the living room and asked if any of us had seen or heard anything unnatural. My aunt immediately said she had heard children playing in the middle of the night, even though the youngest child there was me and I had been asleep. My mom then said she had seen 2 figures rushing down the stairs during the night. She swore they had come from the direction of my room and moved very quickly. One was tall and lanky, the other short and bulky. It couldn't have been me or my cousins. Our bodies didn't match what she described. My dad said that in the middle of the night, the bathroom door in his room suddenly opened. He got up to close it, but it opened again. Frustrated, he shut it once more, locked it this time, and went back to bed. Then the doorknob began to shake violently, and the door slammed open again. He turned away, pulled me close, and hugged me until we both fell asleep. Later, we discovered there was a storeroom on the ground floor, and that the room opposite mine couldn't have been another storeroom. All the utensils and supplies listed on the sheet by the front door were accounted for in the ground floor storeroom. Nothing was missing. To this day, I still don't know what that locked room was used for, or who or what opened the bathroom door, but I am certain that the 2 figures my mom saw rushing down the stairs came from that room. Story 5. I've posted this before, but since I took the time to write it all out again, here it goes. Part 1. I'd been fascinated by ghost stories ever since I was little. In fact, I learned to read from the legend of Sleepy Hollow. From that point on, I was always curious, always eager to listen whenever someone had a ghost story to tell. One summer day, my older brother came back from camp, and the first thing he said to me was, "Boy, I've got a story for you." When we were younger, my brothers went to a Bible camp run by our uncle, but from what I'd heard, they spent more time ziplining, boating, and shooting targets than studying the Bible. Our side of the family had never been particularly religious anyway. Still, my parents had decided that at 12 years old, I was finally old enough to attend. The shooting didn't interest me, nor did the boat rides to the zip line where you'd fly down into the lake at the water's edge. What really excited me was the story my brother was about to tell. The camp had been built in the 1980s, but the land it sat on had a history long before that. Although it was meant to teach young people about the works of God, it carried a name inspired by stranger events that no one had yet explained: Whispering Pines. Back in the 1940s, there was no camp, just a barren stretch of Tennessee forest with a few farmhouses scattered about, their lights visible only when you drew near. The days were hot, as is normal for Tennessee, but the nights were something few people understand these days. A Tennessee night in the wilderness is utterly desolate. Without the glow of city lights, it's hard to see your own hands in front of you, while the constant chorus of insects fills the air. It was on a night like this that the Barlow family arrived from a northern state, traveling along a road that was really more of a beaten-down path to reach the house they had recently built. They had purchased a plot of land to start a farm and raise their family. There was Mr. Barlow, a hard-working man, and Mrs. Barlow. Mrs. Barlow had been ill for some time, and Mr. Barlow hoped that moving her to the quiet of the Tennessee wilderness would help her, away from the constant lights and noise of the city. Mrs. Barlow spent her nights on the porch, sleeping in a hospital bed they had bought at a local auction. She loved that porch and gradually grew to cherish those long, peaceful summer nights. Along with them came their 3 daughters, the twins and Emiline Barlo. The twins were normal children, laughing and chasing fireflies as they explored the forest of whispering pines. But Emiline was a different story. Emiline had long been considered somewhat disturbed. Often Mr. Barlow would go out to the farm to find chickens with broken legs or other injuries, or horses with bruises or burn marks, and these incidents could almost always be traced back to Emiline. She had also been removed from the small schoolhouse as she did not get along with the other children. She would have fits of rage and sometimes become violent. The family always had to keep a sharp eye on her. The caretaker of the property made weekly rounds, visiting all the homeowners in the area to check in and ensure their needs were met, a gesture greatly appreciated by everyone. After all, who doesn't like to be checked on every once in a while? The caretaker rode his horse along the old, beaten-down path toward the Barlow house, cutting through the darkness of the evening. As he neared the property, little was visible beyond the warm glow of lights shining through the windows, but over the constant roar of insects, he could hear something else, something faint yet unmistakable. Whimpering, the low, pitiful cries of dogs pleading for help. A shiver ran down his spine, an eerie feeling settling over him. But as he reached the edge of the property, the whimpering abruptly stopped, and he heard the front door of the Barlow house slam shut. When he finally got close enough to see clearly, his horse halted and began sniffing at something off the side of the path near the barn. It was a dog, and her 4 puppies, but what remained of them was barely recognizable. Their limbs were scattered across the ground, and the mother's throat was wounded, still seeping blood. "Mr. Barlow!" the caretaker screamed, but there was no reply. Still, as a dedicated caretaker, he pressed on toward the house, hoping he wouldn't find anything worse than the puppies. His heart began to race. He had long been aware of Emiline Barlow's reputation and could not shake the fear of what she might be capable of. "Mr. Barlow?" he called again, his voice trembling, every inch of his worn-down heart hoping for a normal answer. There was still no reply. He approached the house and dismounted from his horse. The only sounds now were the screeching of cicadas and the constant hum of crickets. The lights inside the house remained on. The caretaker cautiously moved toward the front steps. On the porch lay the old hospital bed, the one Mrs. Barlow spent nearly every summer night in. He approached it first, praying she was resting peacefully, unaware of the horrors of the evening. "Mrs. Barlow, I know it's late, but I was coming up and His words caught in his throat. The once white sheets were stained red. Mrs. Barlow lay there, gravely injured. Her side had been badly cut, and the side of her head bore a deep gash unlike anything the caretaker had ever seen. The caretaker dropped his lantern on the porch, scattering the flame and plunging him into complete darkness. He screamed for Mr. Barlow, but all that answered was the relentless screeching of cicadas and the sharp chirps of crickets. The night seemed to close in around him. Desperate, he began kicking at the front door, pushing with all his strength, but something held it firmly shut. He slammed and pounded, screaming at the top of his lungs, "Mr. Barlow, let me in! Emiline, somebody!" Still, no one responded. Only the cicadas howled, the crickets chirped, and the suffocating night pressed in on him. Soon, the door gave way and slammed open. For a brief second, the caretaker caught sight of what had been holding it shut. The bodies of the 2 twins lay sprawled across the floor. Before he could call for help, the lantern that had hung in the kitchen window was snatched away. Through the dim light, he saw young Emiline darting out the back door and disappear into the dense Tennessee wilderness. Panicked, the caretaker searched frantically for Mr. Barlow and found him collapsed on the floor of his bedroom. It was too dark to make out the full extent of his injuries, but the caretaker could feel the blood. Emiline was never found. The last anyone saw of her was the flicker of her lantern fading into the forest. Many believe she still roams Whispering Pines, preying on those unfortunate enough to cross her path. Story 6. At some point, another group went out into the woods. One of its members later claimed she'd been followed home by something. The details she gave were fuzzy, but they were strikingly similar to what we'd heard before. A black specter, cloaked like a shadow, circling her house without ever leaving. It all ended in what she described as a dramatic confrontation in her bedroom. Once again, we all rallied around her. After about 2 months, she seemed to have found her answers. She and I had several long talks about the devil, as she called it. To my surprise, she'd never heard the story of Jared, Her group had only been told the woods were haunted, so they went to check it out. They poked around for a bit, got scared, and left. But one thing never changed. Willis. He was always there. We'd use the Ouija board often on our ghost hunts, and he always showed up. It didn't matter who was with us, how many people there were, or even which board we used. Willis still appeared. His angry ranting was always the same, along with that telltale flick of the planchette when it landed on a letter. We'd ask a few questions, but mostly, he only gave threats. One particular night, he threatened to possess whoever fell asleep first and use their body to harm the rest of us. We never took him seriously, especially since Rochelle's birthday had come and gone without any incident. Summer 2005. As usual, summer broke the daily routine of our high school lives. We still went ghost hunting, but less frequently. It was harder to get everyone together. The Wiccan craze was starting to fade, and our numbers had dwindled to less than half. We Ouija'd only rarely, but Willis still appeared with his usual tirades. We began playing airsoft in the woods where the demon supposedly lived. Some people outright refused to join, but the games made the woods feel more familiar to the other kids. Fall 2005. School resumed, bringing a resurgence of activity. Our group had become known as those kids who go ghost hunting all the time. One night after a football game, a large group wanted to give it a try. With Halloween approaching, the consensus was to visit the scariest location we had discovered in our adventures, the woods. About 20 of us packed into cars and drove the few miles to Eric's place. While there, we picked up flashlights, some candles, and his Ouija board. Almost everyone from our old philosophical club came along, including Jared. I'll admit, I was so distracted trying to keep everyone together that I barely noticed his mood. Another large man, David, came with us. It was his first time exploring anything paranormal, and I think he tagged along with Jared. We made the short hike into the woods and settled on the banks of a small creek at the bottom of a hilly slope. Everyone was talking, sharing stories and joking around. Some of the newer members expressed concerns about messing with supernatural forces, but overall the group was relaxed. We lit a few candles and formed a large circle around the Ouija board. Someone gave the usual instructions on how it worked, and questions began. Some were casual, like asking a magic 8-ball. Others were directed at spirits we supposedly could contact. I was off to the edge of the circle, chatting with Eric and another friend about religious beliefs, while our veteran ghost hunters helped the newcomers get involved. Discussions, dares, and hesitant volunteers soon followed, adding to the tense excitement of the night. Things went on as usual until the word wuss caught my attention. We laughed at first. Apparently, Willis couldn't resist showing up again, but then the air shifted. The laughter cut off mid-breath. The pointer stopped moving, and a heavy stillness fell over us like a wet blanket. Every head turned toward the creek. It stood just beyond the reach of our candlelight, a humanoid figure roughly 6 feet tall. Its eyes glowed faintly blue, an unnatural light that had no earthly explanation. Those eyes froze me where I sat. The rest of its form was just a shadow, indistinct and shifting, but those eyes, they felt alive. Panic ripped through the circle, and everyone bolted. Candles snuffed out somehow in the chaos as we scrambled, leaving the board behind. A tangle of teenagers crashed through the woods, running from the thing. I ran too, my heart hammering, my mind spinning, but I stayed near the rear of the group. Jared and David were behind me, struggling with the terrain and their own weight, falling behind as the rest disappeared into the dark. I urged them on, glancing over my shoulder again and again. There were sounds, snapping twigs, branches being shoved aside. Something was following. And through the blackness, those blue eyes flickered between the trees, always there, always moving. Whether it was walking or gliding, I couldn't tell. I just knew it was coming. We hit the slope, its steep incline turning panic into chaos. The bigger guys couldn't climb fast enough, and I was stuck at the rear, hemmed in by fallen branches and loose debris that clawed at my legs. Flight was no longer an option. It was fight or freeze. And then it stopped. I couldn't see where, but it was there, just out of reach, maybe 10 feet away. The air felt heavy, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. For what felt like a full minute, all I heard was my own heartbeat and the rustle of Jared and David clawing their way to the top. Finally, they made it out, and I followed, sidestepping up the incline so I could keep my eyes on the dark below. My gaze darted between the trees, waiting for a flicker of blue eyes, a movement, anything, but the thing didn't show itself. At the top, the group was a wreck. Some kids had bolted ahead to the cars, others lingered, pale and wide-eyed. It was all a disorganized mess. Jared had gone eerily calm, like a switch had flipped the second he rejoined the group. We started the walk back to the cars, jumpy and silent. Every snapped twig made us flinch. The thing didn't follow, or at least that's what I told myself. Deep down, though, I should have known better. That's not how it worked. It never worked that way. By Monday, everyone was talking about it. The thing in the woods had become a legend overnight. A spirit, a wraith, a ghost. Someone even floated the word vampire. The rumors swirled like wildfire, and the reactions were all over the place. Some people were fascinated. Others were terrified. A few flat out stopped speaking to us after that night. I didn't blame them. Unlike the previous year's hunts, I had no ready-made explanation to hand out. No, it was just the wind, or someone was messing with us. Not this time. It was those eyes. Those freaking eyes. How did they glow like that? And why had we all turned to look at the same moment? It was like some other sense, not sight, not sound, had yanked our attention toward it. A few days later, Eric and I went back to the woods to retrieve the Ouija board. It was gone. In daylight, we were finally able to examine the creek. It was about 5 feet across, water flowing evenly over a smooth bed of stones. Anyone or anything wanting to cross would have had to leap it, but I didn't remember hearing a splash, or a thump, or anything. Of course, maybe I just missed it in the chaos. But those eyes. Winter 2005. We stopped ghost hunting for a while. Nobody could agree on what had happened that night, though everyone had theories. We drifted into other distractions. Drinking became the new weekend ritual. Parties took over Friday nights, full of everything high school parties usually are. But one night, in the dead of winter, the old gang reunited. Jared, Thomas, David, Eric, me, and a few others. No Rochelle this time. Instead of rebuilding his lost board, Eric had just bought one from Walmart. Eventually, we sat down and gave it a go. Everyone except David, who leaned back against a wall, content to just watch. The first spirit to show up was Willis. Story 7. My brother was one of those campers. He came home and told me this story, but he made me promise not to tell anyone. None of the other campers could ever know. When I asked how he had found out about it, he said our uncle had told him. And when I asked why, this is what he explained. One night, he had woken up in the hot cabin and desperately needed to use the bathroom. These cabins had no air conditioning and certainly no indoor bathrooms, so campers usually had to go outside into the woods. He stepped out that night and began doing his business, making faces in the mud with his stream, when something caught his attention. Off in the darkness, he saw a lantern swaying, slowly making its way toward the cabin. He yelled, assuming it was one of the counselors on patrol. "Sorry, I really had to go," chuckling nervously. But his chuckle faded when there was no response. His heart raced as he bolted back to the cabin and dove into bed. For what felt like hours, he heard footsteps circling the cabin. Finally, summoning all his courage, he screamed. The counselor jolted awake, banged his head in the process, and just like that, the footsteps stopped. When my brother told the counselor the story, the man just smiled and said, "Probably a raccoon. Don't let your imagination get the best of you." The next morning, they found footprints, barefoot footprints, pressed deep into the mud, circling the cabin in uneven, almost deliberate loops. The counselors pulled my older brother aside and told him a story they swore he could not repeat. They didn't want to frighten the campers. It was the story of Emiline Barlo. Of course, my brother told me anyway, and me, being the biggest ghost fanatic in the world, wanted to know everything. That's when he dropped the real kicker. And apparently, he whispered, the abandoned Barlow house still exists. That was it. I had to see it. I pestered my uncle relentlessly, calling him and begging him to take me there the following year. Every time, I got the same answer. Maybe, or we'll see. The kind of brush-off adults give when they're hoping you'll forget. I didn't forget. When the next summer rolled around, I packed up my gear and went to camp with one goal in mind, to finally see the Barlow house for myself. Again and again, I begged my uncle to take me out to the house in his truck, but all I got were vague no's and we'll sees. Days passed. We shot guns, we rode boats, we ziplined. Everything the camp was known for, but none of it mattered. My mind was on the house. Then, one evening after dinner, my uncle leaned in close, lowering his voice so no one else could hear. "Tonight is the night," he said. "We'll meet at 12 at the lodge. Don't tell anyone." Being 12 meant I was no longer a little first, second, third, fourth, or even fifth grader. No, at the top of the food chain as one of the sixth graders, I felt a kind of courage I'd never had before. I was ready. That night, my uncle, my older brother, the other camp director, and I piled into his old Ford pickup and drove what felt like miles into the heart of the Tennessee wilderness. We weren't on roads anymore. These were old, beaten-down paths, so overgrown they barely existed. And the only sound when we finally stopped was the deafening roar of insects. The night was upon us. "Now the Barlow house is about a mile up this road," the camp director said, "but there's too much brush to take the truck through. We're gonna have to walk it." So far, I was fine. Giddy, even. This was it. I was finally going to stare a ghost down and prove to my older brother and uncle the man I thought I was. But as we walked closer, that excitement started to crack. I began to wonder if Emiline was watching us from the trees. I thought I heard footsteps behind us, or maybe saw the faint glow of a lantern weaving through the woods. My uncle chuckled and waved it off. He slung an arm around my shoulders, and my brother gave me a reassuring pat on the back. Nothing to worry about, they said. My courage began to return. As long as I was with my older brother, the camp director, and my uncle, I felt untouchable. Their calm seemed to rub off on me, and I kept walking. That courage vanished the instant all four of us stopped in our tracks. Ahead, echoing through the trees, came the faint whimpering of puppies. The sound bounced off the forest in strange hollow ways, like it was coming from everywhere at once. I could sense the shift in the men around me, the same unease I felt tightening their shoulders and slowing their steps, and that only magnified my own fear. I whispered that I didn't want to go any farther, that I wanted to go back, but they were determined to see what it was. In all their years of coming here, nothing had ever happened. Their curiosity made tears roll down my cheeks. I was terrified. I didn't care about proving I was a man anymore. I just wanted to be home in my bed, safe under the covers. Still, we marched on. As we neared the house, a lantern flickered shakily in the kitchen window. The camp director turned to us. "You boys stay back," he said. "We're going to check it out." My brother and I were frozen, both of us trembling. He didn't even tease me for crying, something he would have done in a heartbeat under normal circumstances. Instead, he stood right beside me, just as paralyzed as I was. As my uncle and the director moved farther away toward the house, our fear spiked. Despite their orders, we ran to catch up, insisting we weren't staying behind, no matter what. When we reached the porch, I saw the hospital bed still there, empty and rusted. The door to the house stood just to the left, and my uncle moved toward it. "I'm not going in," I whispered. I begged him not to open it, but he stepped forward anyway. With a kick, he swung the door open, and the lantern light vanished. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move along the back of the house toward the rear door. Then, the back door slammed open and shut with a deafening bang, and for a moment the chorus of Tennessee cicadas and crickets fell completely silent. My uncle scooped me up, and we ran the entire mile back to the truck. That night, none of us got much sleep. And even now, I still have nightmares about Emiline Barlo and the Whispering Pines. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.